Hey guys, Yap here. There are so many units in FEH at this point, a lot of which vary in strength and overall quality, but have you ever thought about the absolute worst unit ever released into the game? I'm sure y'all already got a bunch of answers in your mind, or you're skimming through the video to check as we speak. I know who you are. I've talked about all sorts of bad units before, but more often than not, they have some sort of way out so that they could become usable in some fashion. Even if they aren't that great to use over other units, they've usually been able to contribute something with some elbow grease here and there, but sometimes there are units that are completely irredeemable to the point where there's realistically nothing that you could have done to salvage them. I really got thinking on this since Choose Your Legends 9 is getting close, and what with most of Choose Your Legends 8 basically falling out of favor for most people, it really makes you think about how fast unit relevancy comes and goes, and whether that's the end-all be-all, especially these days where units require so much to be usable at minimum. Is it even worth worrying about anymore so long as they can be used in some capacity? And with all the types of skill, support, and overall inheritables we have in the game currently, is it even possible for IS to release an outright unusable unit now? Regardless of your stance on that, it does beg the question, who's been the absolute worst of them all so far? Although I say so far as if there's even a remote possibility of them making a unit that much worse relative to their original release. If I were to include demotes, then it would be a lot easier to get an answer, but I feel like that's not only too easy of a way out, but also that's not as interesting as units that were 5-star locked and debuted with PRFs, not to mention a good amount of them, while being dead on arrival generic demotes, many of them were able to get away with something due to skill accessibility or their stat lines. So if going by those metrics, there's still so many units worth considering that it might take an extremely long time to come to a notable candidate. It's Berkut. Fallen Berkut to be exact. Let's talk about it. So out of any premium unit in this game, why Fallen Berkut specifically? If it had to come down to any unit, the best way I was going to narrow it down was by archetypes, and his is easily one of the worst ones in the entire game, and not just currently, it was a contender for a very long time. After that, it boiled down to his kit and stats. And speaking of which, Fallen Berkut released around May of 2019, and don't you feel old, huh? That was over 6 years ago now. Anyway, he came with a PRF Lance in Crime Held, and I almost definitely butchered that name. If a ranged unit initiated combat against Berkut, he got distant counter, follow-up denial, and if he attacked, then the nearest ally took 20 damage after his combat. Obviously, by today's standards, that looks really bad, but it looked pretty bad when it came out too. So even before taking his archetype into account, the fact that it didn't work against melee threats was already pretty bad. Not that it would have saved him at the time, but for what was supposed to be the Omni-Tank Cavalry unit, not taking into account a common range type was a very odd choice. The chip damage portion also never made any sense to me since there wasn't ever a trade-off that you got out of it either. Nothing that could have scaled based on damaged allies or it being easy enough to set up for Gale Force shenanigans since they required combat. It was just another effect tacked onto it that only made him seem less worthwhile to run in the end. But even if he didn't have the ally chip effect on his weapon, being an enemy phase cav just wasn't that good. Even to this day, the amount of cavalry that were built for the enemy phase or could succeed at it was very minimal. There was legendary Self after his remix and refine, but that didn't even last that long. Just look at how much he had to get though in order to really make up for the archetype. Built-in Miracle, enemy phase Brave, true damage, null counter disrupt, and so much more. He got 3 kitchen sinks worth of effects at the time. But other than him, you had Winter Dimitri, who was a pretty okay Vantage Sweeper and Summoner Duel's Checkmate unit, Ares when he came out since he could Vantage and special spam, and Brave hitters to the extent that they could just run Vantage, but that was still worse than other options at the time, and wow, that's a lot of Vantage, ain't it? There might be a reason why some of the most successful enemy phase cavalry almost never attempted to tank in the first place. Honestly, the concept of an enemy phase cav unit is so weird to me since cavalry are known for their movement, but enemy phase units almost never take advantage of that aspect. Definitely not helped by the fact that they get reduced stat totals in exchange for the extra movement that they're almost never going to use either. Compared to an infantry unit, cavalry get on average 10 less BST and have to divvy up their stats in the right places to work well, which to be fair was basically every unit ever released, but even more so when you have way less BST to work with. Especially in an omni-tank role, did you prioritize your speed for more damage output and potentially less doubles, your defense and res for better tanking? Did you take a hit to some stats to make it a lot more evened out? There was never really a right answer that led to one of them really thriving from it, although it's funny because I'm pretty sure some people ran omni-tank Brave Crom, but he also had uncapped stats and bonus copying, which did give him the opportunity to try it. Meanwhile, Fallen Berkut had a mostly min-max stat line, dumping his speed stat for extra bulk, but you weren't really going to get a lot out of a unit with 30 base res, no stat swings, and no means of doubling outside of Quick Riposte 3, which was not ideal in the slightest. So he mostly just came and went as a unit with an okay tier 4 skill at the time, but because he was already at his lowest point, it could have only gone up from there. It did not go up from there. 3 years later, we got post-refined Fallen Berkuts around the middle of Book 6, and to say it helped him to some degree would mean he wouldn't qualify as one of the worst units ever released into the game. This refine did not help him. Crime Held, and I think I butchered it again, went from a weapon that gave distant counter, follow-up denial if the foe was ranged, and ally chip if he was within 2 spaces of an ally, to a weapon that increased the range to 3 spaces and allowed it to work against any foe that initiated on him, added 5 attack and defense debuffs during combat, and a guaranteed follow-up if either the foe initiated combat or if their HP was at least at 75% or more, and that sure did not change much of anything about him whatsoever. At the very least, his guaranteed follow-up and extra stats weren't locked to the enemy phase, but that didn't really change much about what made him bad to begin with. Not to mention, null follow-up was running rampant at the time, to the point where auto follow-ups just weren't feasible in most cases. Nowadays, it's a lot better since they've been releasing less null follow-up into the game, allowing for both guaranteed follow-ups and follow-up denial effects to thrive a bit more, but you sure aren't using that weapon regardless. They could have at least tacked on some damage reduction if against a ranged foe, as that would have at least let him survive a bit more, but as nukes and tanks also got stronger, the bar for minimal tanking was beyond what he could do with his PRF and archetype alone. Not to mention he had even less tools at his disposal than he does now. This refine was also at a point where IS overvalued distant counter in the weapon to an insane degree that most distant counter weapon refines were very mediocre, to put it lightly. Some of the exceptions coming from Ryoma, who got no follow-up in their refine, Brave Dimitri, who got true damage reduction at a time where it wasn't remotely common, and Black Knight and Zelgius, who got slaying but only got away with it because of having Black Luna as their PRF special. The problem is that distant counter just wasn't strong enough on its own to warrant mediocre refines, as other units with a distant counter A slot and better PRFs almost always outperformed any unit with a distant counter weapon. I also have a video going over that too if you want to learn more information on that, but for all intents and purposes, there was a reason why the term distant counter curse was a thing for a while. Although audio quality may vary, my mic quality was very bad for a while, and it's improved at least nowadays, right? Right? I wonder if the reason they overvalued distant counter at the time was because of year 1 standouts like Ryoma, Xander, and Camus, all of which who had distant counter baked into their weapons and were fairly strong, but that was also at a time where we didn't have super duper tanks and nukes outside of like Reinhardt, so just being able to counter back was seen as really good. However, that wasn't really the only problem Berkut was facing at the time of his refine. I think the largest contribution here, besides having a really bad PRF and refine in an archetype that almost never works out, was the lack of skill access. Even now when they drop a really mediocre or outright terrible units, a lot of them can still function really well, sometimes at a high level. Female Grimo, the one we got a couple months ago, is the greatest example of that. Her PRF isn't exactly that good, far from usable of course, but there are issues with it, namely the lack of slaying, but even the bonuses she gives out aren't exactly amazing either, but they're far from terrible. That said, her being a melee armor gives her so many more outs than almost any other archetype because of her access to all sorts of armor skills. Even if you want to ditch your PRF for an arcane weapon, melee armors have so many tools at their disposal that even the absolute worst one is still extremely usable in almost every single game mode. And even by extension of being a dragon armor, she can also use anti-warp save skills that help her stand out a bit more. Skill accessibility plays so much of a role in any unit's performance that units that could be perceived as really bad can end up being really solid if they have the right inheritables. And unfortunately, Fallen Berkut hasn't had any inheritables that benefit his role as an enemy phase cav unit, which is still the case to this day. And on that point, I think there are a lot of arguments for all sorts of range flyers as well, since they've also struggled with skill accessibility for so many years. It was so bad to the point where even coming with a PRF weapon wasn't good enough at times, leading to so many of them being dead on arrival in most cases, with the exception coming from support units. It took them up until year 7 of the game to have some notable options, mostly having to rely on inheritable weapons and nothing else until that point in time. And even now they have so many more options at their disposal that I think you could use a decent amount of them with a relative success. Enemy phase cavalry still lack a lot of options for that role, and in a lot of ways it's for the same reason as ranged armors, although arguably to a worse extent. At least ranged armors, despite being really bad at their job, can do one thing, and that's protect an ally, even if it is only once. Enemy phase cavalry really can't do much of anything at the moment, and I'm not really sure if they're going to be able to anytime soon. Even cavalry units that were designed to be mixed phase ended up not being able to do either effectively, to a point where many of them had to forego their enemy phase just for a better player phase. And between being a ranged flyer that struggled to deal damage in the player phase versus a cavalry that failed to tank in the enemy phase, at least you could patch the former a bit, although the extent of which was very minimal, so it's really a matter between trash and garbage. Moreover, the amount of enemy phase cavalry there are in the game isn't nearly as much as other archetypes, but we've had enough of them to show that it's an archetype that not only fails a lot of the time, but it's inherently flawed by design. And it's not even like they couldn't make them work at all, but they've yet to give them the tools necessary to really get them going. Although, even if they did, would you still even consider using them over any other infantry or armor unit at that point? What could they possibly give enemy phase cavs that not only let them stand out amongst most other enemy phase units in the game, but also works well enough to be worth considering in the first place? Compared to infantry and armors that have so many more enemy phase tools, what could cavalry realistically do better without introducing an entirely new exclusive niche that gives them a purpose? And maybe that's what they need to do, but whether it's worth it to them at all is a question of its own. And despite how much Fallen Berkut has been mishandled between the archetype he was put into, the lack of inheritable options for that role, followed by the DC refine curse that didn't address any of his issues, he's not the absolute worst unit these days. Of course, he wouldn't be using his PRF weapon at all, but there's enough in the game that can allow him to go into a player phase role, which is really the best thing he could do at this point. Enemy phase is completely out of the question for him, but that's better than nothing, especially with newer inheritable lances as well as his A, B, and C slots, but it still requires a good amount of investment and support to get going. Johanna Lance released earlier this year and has allowed so many units to deal considerable damage than they really have any right to. Even the worst of the worst can still hit really hard thanks to the weapon, and with newer support such as Reflux from Legendary Black Knight and T Ingrid, you could stack 2 layers of it and have any lance and dagger unit deal so much damage now. Of course, many units with Reflux support can do a lot of damage, and it really is just those 2 units lifting up 90% of the damage dealers in the game currently, but it's better that than never being able to do anything ever. There's also Summer Balthus's weapon that can grant true damage and true damage reduction based on visible bonuses between the unit and allies. Dual Marth and Eikthenir are fantastic enablers of the land, since they can raise the ceiling very easily to upwards of 40 true damage per hit and 20 true damage reduction. And as far as skill accessibility goes, most if not all of it is player phase oriented, but melee cavalry do have a lot of solid options on that front. Excel is a fantastic go-to A slot since it's extra true damage reduction. Blue Skies is a nice option for Canto 2 and some true damage in exchange for some of that true damage reduction that you'd get from Excel. Sly skills are also there too that give considerable stat swings, 5 true damage, and a guaranteed follow-up, but I wouldn't take it over Excel or Blue Skies in most cases, especially since momentum exists in the B slot that not only grants a guaranteed follow-up, but there aren't really any other notable options for him specifically. His stat line doesn't really allow him to take advantage of Potent Assault, and the other options he has access to just aren't as good as momentum, especially since it also gives upwards of 2 special jumps. At least his C slot options fare a lot better in Insight Hone, Outcry Dull, and Shadow Shifter Smite if you want to have a bit of extra utility. On top of his access to Lull Echo and Sly Echo, he can have a pretty great, solid, decent, okay player phase. Just okay, it's just okay. Which, to be fair, is still better than a decent amount of other units at this time. Generic swords only just recently got some extra tools to make them usable again. Staff units have been getting buffed all year. Ranged armors still suck. So yeah, it could be a whole lot worse than it is currently. But if you think there's another unit that qualifies more than Fallen Berkut as the absolute worst unit ever released into the game, then let me know. Whoever can name me a better candidate with solid reasoning gets, I don't know what they'll get, but you'll know when it happens. Also, bonus points if the answer is funny. And yeah, that sure is the end of the video. I don't have anything to say, so bye.
The end.